No, this is the strategic planning night.
What?
No, I think it's a separate one.
Right, because there was a October.
Because council's on the 2nd of October, so it'll be this, that's the second Monday of the month.
Right, okay, he's right, that's second. So the second, 16th, and then we're doing strategic planning the 23rd then?
City council has every Monday occupied in the month of October till Thanksgiving.
So it's 23rd, is it? That's not-
Between this, strategic planning, special meetings, and regular council meetings.
Love our Monday night, so.
Apparently.
You keep running away. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is the Saline City Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, September 13th. Will the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young,
Here.
Carroll,
Here.
Fosdick, absent. Morrow,
Here.
Yerba. Here. Cole. Here. Beardsley, absent. Heft. Here. Troika.
Here.
Staff present tonight include City Planner Auerbach, Community Development Director Harrington, and Recording Secretary Katnick. Is there a motion on the table to approve the agenda as distributed? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion on the table to approve the meeting minutes of August 23rd as submitted? Second. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person.
Hi, I'm Jen Harmount. I'm just here to observe tonight. I just had a question, though, if there was a meeting for July, because I didn't see any meeting minutes, and I just was curious if there was a meeting for the Planning Commission in July, and just was maybe not posted for the meeting minutes.
I feel like we met in July. My recollection is we met once. We had one meeting. Yes. It looks like maybe it was worded differently than the other minutes on Demand, but there was a meeting on July 26th.
Okay, I just saw that the last meeting minutes posted was for June 14th, so I just wanted to check on that. That's all I
We'll check
have.
on that. Thank you.
Yep.
New business, number 23-22, 2023 Saline Master Plan Draft, Future Land Use Chapter, a motion to instruct staff to incorporate Planning Commission comments into a revised version of this draft. In our packet, we had a memo dated September 8th from Community Development Director Harrington.
Absolutely. So Planner Auerbach is here tonight to help also absorb some of your commentary and notes. This is technically the longest PowerPoint you'll see in terms of total number of slides, but do not worry, it will not take that long. They're just maps. So it's an action item that just allows you to make a motion at the end of it and have a little bit more free-flowing of a discussion in a more organized manner rather than just doing it as a discussion item. We tried that a little bit earlier this year and it was a little wonky, so I figured that this would just be a better way to approach it. So without further ado, we can hop into the future land use chapter here and just go over where the city's at to start. The City Council approved distribution at their Monday meeting. I sent out the required distribution, or I sent out the draft to the required parties this afternoon, so we have begun the 63-day process. Myself, Planner Auerbach, and Principal Planner Ben Carlisle have all met to start going over a second round of edits of things that we've caught throughout the review of this ourselves. It's a rather long document, so things get missed on the first go through. And then over the next 2 months, we'll bring back sections of this to you specifically to get more granular input on the content of this plan. So the layout of the plan, we have two key things. We have sub areas, and then we'll have land use designations and future land use. So just go over the sub areas. We have all of our sub areas described by characteristics, which are descriptions of these areas as they are now. Development strategies, what the city wants to see considered when doing reviewing new development in the area. I worded that really poorly. Design guidelines, what look, aesthetic, intensity of development we would like to see in these areas. And then please review the red line draft in your packets. I can provide one to the public as well, and compare them with the 2017 plan to review all the changes made, because I'm not going to read the whole plan to you this evening. I don't think anyone would really want to sit through that. So to start off, this was the Michigan Ave sub-area featured in the 2017 map. I tried to highlight it to the best of my abilities. I kind of free-handed with the mouse, so please excuse some of the oversights there. And this is the new breakdown for the 2023 plan. So we have a specific West Michigan Avenue sub-area, and we have a downtown sub-area. And we went over this in the last meeting, but we felt it was important to distinguish the differences between the western part of the city and the downtown part of the city. So the development strategies that we have, I have the top two crossed off that were featured in the draft attached to you. This is something that CWA and I went over, and for a variety of reasons, we thought it was best to remove those and then instead switch it to support redevelopment opportunities that increase the area's vitality. It doesn't target any specific property owner and doesn't instigate or insinuate that the city is going to be actively instigating or trying to involve itself in private development. Additionally, new development in this area should focus on bringing essential services such as a grocer or a pharmacy to the west side of Saline. This is a very frequent public comment we've received both in and out of this process, and we think that it's essential to bring more of those essential services to the west side of the community. Additionally, as you'll see throughout this, encourage non-motorized transportation through the establishment of pedestrian and bicycle safety paths, linking residential areas with park, school, and shopping facilities, and other pedestrian and bicycle paths. This was featured in the 2017 plan, but due to the amount of folks who flag safety concerns and just general desire for more pedestrian and bike infrastructure throughout Saline, you're going to see it as included in pretty much every sub-area in the city. For our design guidelines, new development in the sub-area should be designed with the intent of minimizing sprawl and increasing non-motorized connectivity to the rest of the Saline community. Encourage low-impact development. New development shall be designed in a manner that efficiently allocates frontage to many different users as opposed to one. Encourage the creation of attractive, modern, and sustainably built LEED commercial service buildings and sites. It's all highlighted in green because we created this new sub-area, so all these standards are brand new. And again, somewhat in response to public comment, somewhat in response to generally where the profession of planning and new development should be headed within our community. For the downtown development strategy, so just to take, oh, I flipped the wrong one here. So just to take you back, that's the one highlighted in red on this screen is the downtown. So for downtown development strategies, we carried over most of them from 2017. There had to be some careful rewording, but essentially item number 6 there is to adopt a new downtown corridor plan design study that proposes alternatives the city could pursue as well as estimated costs. Alternatives meaning other ways that we could use our space downtown. The study should support alternatives that will bolster resident leisure and recreation and or attract new private investment. And then 7, place an emphasis on the attraction of retail services and restaurant users to the downtown core. Under design guideline, we have, although context-based, compatible residential land uses in the sub-area are single-family, city density, high density, and downtown district residential. We added to allow for and encourage shared parking opportunities, continue to provide and refine the appropriate architectural standards, implement any new design study that we do conduct by the city and its partners, and then again, really looking at minimizing sprawl and increasing non-motorized access within our community. Moving our attention to the eastern part of the city, in 2017, all of this industrial East Michigan Ave was classified as business industrial sub-area. And again, we felt it was important to break it out and to define 2 different things that have occurred in the sub-area. We have the industrial parks, which are both north and southeast, and then but along East Michigan Ave, we have a lot of commercial development that's separate and notably different development type and style than our industrial parks. So again, we kind of rewrote a whole new design standards, looking at that first one that we crossed off, support development opportunities that increase the area's vitality rather than insinuating that we're going to be directly targeting specific property owners. Again, discouraging strip development, encouraging the maximum efficiency of our frontage on US 12, which is some of our most valuable land in the community. It's the most high trafficked land, so trying to get the most bang for our buck, so to speak. Encourage infill development that creates more efficient use of our land on US 12. Business retention and attraction should be a primary strategy in the sub-area. Compatible future uses should increase the variety of high-quality goods and services that are available in Saline. And then lastly, again, that and call to and bolster our non-motorized transit through pedestrian and bicycle safety paths, linking these areas with other areas in our community. For the design guidelines, the first one is slightly modified from what's featured in your packet. Existing buffers separating incompatible residential uses from their commercial industrial counterparts shall be retained. The SPA1 is our mixed-use district, so this whole thing falls in a zoning district that allows for a variety of commercial, residential, and industrial uses. It's really important that we make sure that we're not putting a resident right next to the Forcia plant, for example. I think another important point here, which is kind of a pullover from the last plan as well, is to encourage the creation of service drives and where possible access from Bemis Road to limit the number of new curb cuts on East Michigan Avenue. And then again, looking at modern types of development techniques to ensure low impact on our stormwater, to ensure that they're being built within the environment lead in mind. And again, really trying to maximize what we're getting out of our own frontage here. So this is just a high-level review of all those changes made. The green boxes on the left indicate the new areas, and the red areas on the right talk about what we just went over. The arrow on the top is just highlighting that we have now acknowledged that Bella Terrace, not the St. Annalena Farms, is in the city of Saline. It's reflected on these maps, and it will be subsequently reflected on all future maps of the city. So moving on to future land use, as I've mentioned throughout this process, the future land use map is the most consequential document in this plan, but it is still amendable and flexible as we go over time. But then looking into ways that we describe our land uses. So we'll hop into the map in a section, but the way that we talk about our land use classifications. So one of the things that we highlighted was the density allowed in each of our residential land use district. I'm actively working with our folks at CWA to choose better units per acre numbers. They're rather high right now. And reframe it altogether to be discussing desired form rather than necessarily a units per acre number, which, as I've discussed with some of you before, is not really the best way at regulating density. It's kind of an arbitrary figure. Another quote that we have in this section, it is vital that the city promote a diversity of housing products available to current and future residents, really looking at higher density single family and high density, low multifamily, so townhomes, row houses, that type of thing that our code doesn't really currently allow by right. Under general business, there's an emphasis on reevaluating our SPA1 standards, specifically really looking at those side setbacks in our potentially the landscape plan. It's kind of there, it's kind of not, and we should really enshrine a better landscape plan in our code. And then lastly, flexibility with industrial spaces. So the quote in there is the adaptive reuse or redevelopment of properties on the edge of industrial districts into services/places that more directly serve Saline residents should be considered. So it's not uncommon to see conversions of old industrial buildings, whether in Ann Arbor, in Ypsilanti, into something that is more modern, is newer, whether that be kind of a food market where you have a variety of different restaurant vendors. I've seen them go into Fulling in Ypsilanti, which is like a bowling football thing. There's another chain throughout America called Chicken and Pickle that converts light industrial buildings into both a fried chicken restaurant and indoor pickleball courts. So breweries would be another common example. But again, looking at ways that we can convert our existing spaces to better suit our residents, understanding that we're kind of confined with the land that's currently within the city as we're almost fully developed as a community. So to go over specific changes on our future land use map, this is one that we talked about at our last meeting, which is North Ann Arbor and Lodi Township. It's the section of North Ann Arbor that is currently an island within Lodi Township, although we have just annexed one of these properties in. In 2017, it had the professional business designation as a future. Looking to 2023, as discussed at the last meeting, it has an office service designation going forward. There's not a ton of difference between these two districts, but there is some notable uses, higher intensity uses we can say allowed in the office service district in 2023 that are not allowed in the PB district. We've talked about potentially reevaluating the uses allowed in these types of buffer districts as well. The next one is the former hospital campus, which is now operated by Evangelical Homes or Trinity Healthcare. It's one of the two. It was 2017, it was designated for low-density residential. As I'm sure as anyone who's driven by that, it's solid cement. It's almost entirely an impervious surface because it is a large hospital campus. It was never designed to be single-family homes. So Acknowledging that, we've now switched it to high-density residential, which is where Mill Pond Manor is, as well as one of their senior care homes. So those are both examples of high-density residential uses. It's the existing use. We should probably reflect it unless we have a genuine intention of forcing Mill Pond Manor and the senior home out of Saline. And then additionally, looking at the hospital campus itself that's being used for offices, the Montessori, we've switched that to general business designation. If Saline were ever to have a waterfront district, and this is still kind of a pipe dream of mine, it would likely be on the former hospital campus. It's already uniquely positioned to potentially allow for commercial businesses. It overlooks Mill Pond Park. Same thing with the Legion there on the corner. So I think this is a common sense change, and one that I think both property owners have expressed that they would be very amenable to me, especially the Montessori, which really has a benefit if they switch to a general business designation. Next is Maple Oaks, which in 2017 was classified as industrial. Obviously, Maple Oaks is now developed into homes and has become residential. The parcel just north of the railroad is technically part of the brownfield agreement they have with the city. So in theory, it is at some point supposed to also become some sort of residential development. The lot itself is not very wide, so there's going to be some real concerns we have with whatever they choose to do with that. It's likely going to have to at least go through a variance, if not get another PUD for it. So something to be on the lookout for, but it's technically supposed to be part of this larger residential development, so we thought it was important to reflect that on the master plan. Again, just looking at these high-level changes, again, Bella Terrace is now brought into the city. And then on both the east and west side of the community, we had some that were mislabeled as Central Business District, the La Fontaine dealership, as well as those in Sauk Trails where the hotel is going to go. So we've now since changed those to the appropriate surrounding land use that it was meant to be. And then Berwick Park, interestingly enough, was slated to be multiple family residential. It doesn't technically meet our standards for multiple family, so we removed it and pushed it back to city density residential, which again reflects really what it is. So just making some important clarifications and changes there. And that kind of tees us up for this. There you have a couple items for your considerations. What are your thoughts on the locations of the sub areas? Are there any that you think should cover more or less area? Are there specific characteristics, development strategies, or design guidelines when you were reading through this that you take issue with or would like to be refined? Are there any that you would want to be added to these districts? Do you have any feedback on the way we're classifying these land uses? On the future land use map, are you opposed to any of the changes we've made? Is there anything else you believe ought to be changed? And then lastly, are there any other items in this specific chapter that you've had commentary on? And I'll throw it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. You just said a lot.
Yes, sorry.
No, that's fine. I just, for our clarification, we obviously have this packet. Do you want us to provide comments? We'll take verbal comments now, but do you want a set of marked up from us? Like, how do you want this?
Yeah, I was just planning on verbal comments, but if you have written comments that you would like to share with me, please do. I'm happy to take them in any form they come in, provided I have a general idea of where in the document it says that. So either a page number or maybe a paragraph would be very helpful so that we can find that and make that correction. So
Just to confirm for Planning Commission's edification, what is the absolute deadline for getting you feedback?
So this 63-day period is going to run out on November 15th, so probably by late October. So let's do October 23rd as our goal for that.
Okay,
Give them more than enough time. Good.
great, thank you. All right, any questions? Well, I guess let's acknowledge the memo.
I'll move to acknowledge the memo dated September the 8th.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments, questions from Planning Commission members? Let's get started. Yes, Mr. Gerber.
I have a couple different ones. I have specific issues and some things, but I have some overall ones. When we're looking at things, we're talking about historical context and those terminologies. We don't really mention the words preservation or harmony, and I think those need to be in there as part of it. Some of these could potentially impact the preservation, keeping of some of the historical buildings. And then just for my own understanding, I think for us, we're talking land use versus actual zoning that we currently have. So when you mention, land use, general business for up near the evangelical home, is that basically saying we're going to change it to that kind of zoning, or is it just that we're stating it now with some thought in the future?
So when we state it, and we put it in a future land use map, it means we have the intention to rezone. So we have to bring our zoning in conformity with the future land use plan. So the overarching goal is to rezone it. I have talked to both the property owners, and they're amenable to being rezoned into that for their own personal interest too. It gives them more flexibility with what they can do with the property if and when they choose to sell.
I'm interested in it, but I don't suspect the residents that live in all the fine single homes around there are. So those are the concerns I have when we do something like that, yeah, the property owner themselves may be interested in it, but the overlying area may not. And so I don't want to necessarily create a situation that is going to create a situation in the future.
Right, and that's kind of why we introduced it through the future land use plan as a litmus test to see what is the city's position on it. Ultimately, if it's rezoned, the property owners would be required to be required to be noticed. There's specific provisions in the code where they could petition if they dislike the rezoning aspect of it. So I think that's there. I would add that practically speaking, it has always been what we're classifying it as now. It has always been a commercial business of some type. Whether we want to acknowledge a hospital as a traditional commercial business is kind of beside the point, but it currently operates as a Montessori, which is a private commercial business, and as offices for a nonprofit.
But generally those are approved based on special land use too in those areas.
One was approved via a variance. I don't necessarily understand the genesis for the hospital to have offices, for Trinity Healthcare to have offices there. So
Probably was part of their original Trinity Health. It's a non-conforming use.
okay, fair enough.
I don't believe Trinity maintains any offices on that campus anymore.
All right, my understanding was that they were in the front of that building.
No, I think they've completely unloaded to even.
Sorry, excuse me, Evangelical Homes manages the offices there. I conflate the two.
Correct.
And then some of the other ones, I just noticed like there's a couple islands when you look at the current versus the proposed, like on Maple Road, that one now is in the city, which is the house there next to R&B there, or wherever that building is. So the one on the corner of Maple and Woodland, that one we should just basically have whatever we brought it into the city as, so no longer need to show it as an island. There are a couple of the other properties. One that is interesting is the one that's on Monroe Street. Initially when it was put there, it's in front of our wastewater treatment plant. That was supposed to be a sales office for the development that never happened with ADM property. And then it kind of became a home. So being that it's commercial, we may not necessarily, it's really an island in that whole area. And I don't know what we want to do with that in terms of actually looking at changing that. I do know that there is the other daycare center there, but that's been there for a while. I don't know if commercial necessarily is the appropriate use for that. But then the other ones, there's a couple other, when you look at the use for where the depot is, one of those should be probably public, private use. Maybe the way the map's designed, but just make sure those ones are that.
So just so I understand on that, we're talking.
On Bennett Street, where the depot is, and the lot that ajuts.
Right, so I guess looking at how it's reflected on the most recent future land use map, you're looking for something like how Rentschler Farms is. I don't know if you, okay,
Or Parkland.
Parkland, okay.
And as I mentioned, the historical aspects and things. One of the things, when we talk about low density and redefining these different, from single family to like low density and those things, you proposed in here like, the one example, moving from 3 to 6 units and then talking about infill. My concern with that type of change would encourage the removal or destruction of homes and redevelopment of those lots because we've now given that ability to do that. That will require a whole change in the terms of, frontage and those type of things that we currently require frontage. And I don't know if we've actually talked about that and the impact that could have on the city.
Right, so I would say take the existing density numbers in that packet with a grain of salt. They're necessarily going to have to change. Like I said, they're a little bit too high, or a little is an understatement. They're too high, so we need to reframe how we're thinking about those density numbers. But with that specifically, yes, I mean, I think the larger idea is looking at how we're regulating a single-family land use and the lot sizes, the lot frontage required, and maybe allowing for things like the proposed development at 207 Monroe to happen in a more by right-ish fashion. That's smaller lots, smaller amount of frontage. But yes, the infill aspect of it should be reevaluated, and I'll take a look at that.
And then the other one, we do have a section called mobile homes. How do we address tiny homes? I mean, that's going to be the thing moving forward. And tiny homes sometimes can be on a permanent foundation, or they're basically just like another trailer.
I would think any language about mobile homes, you'd essentially want to leave in place any master plan language and then your zoning language. The zoning language would have to go to the state for approval. So generally, unless you're expecting a proposal, we would say don't touch that. You can get as specific as you like about tiny homes, be it through form, language. It depends on what your priorities are.
But that doesn't fall underneath a mobile home type of scenario, where I know a mobile home has to be in it, because otherwise you get in trouble, because I know that's what happened in the township. That's why we have that one on the edge of our city. So if that was to come up, would we create, just like you said, would we create a different type of zoning for that then?
I think it would come back to, in part, just the your floor area requirements, height, things like that. I think there is a specific definition for what is and isn't a mobile home, at least as far as the building code and zoning is concerned.
And then the definition of trailer versus mobile home too? Because I think a mobile home has permanent connections where a trailer may not necessarily have it.
I don't know if our ordinance specifically defines the difference between those two, but to Planner Auerbach's point, like, it's not something the city wants to reopen. It runs us a risk, yeah.
Because that has come up in discussions and this whole thing about smaller homes.
Right, so I'll just add, we just had a new one put in because one was condemned like fall of last year, I think. So with that, it still has to go through a building permit review process. It has to be placed on a foundation. I don't know what specifics the building official is looking for with the placement of those homes. Does it have to be traditionally a trailer, or could it be like a prefab shack that somebody, tiny home that somebody makes, like that would be like 600 square feet? So I can ask the building official and maybe provide you clarification on that specifically.
Okay. That's pretty much, the only other one I had was on page 35. And I think it was, we kind of mentioned it, it's the context versus structures, it's the preservation and such. So with that, my answers right now, I can give you my document that has my markups on it. So.
Thank you.
Additional questions, comments?
Did you have a point about the rezoning thing mentioned earlier?
Just that it's certainly not a commitment to rezone. You can always change it later. It doesn't mean you have to change the zoning later on. Another consideration, though, which I think you mentioned during that part of the discussion, was it gives you that menu of special use language to choose from. So even under the current zoning, if a special use proposal were to come in, you'd be relying on, in part, that future land use language as a basis for your decision for or against whatever use that is. So that's another consideration for whether you want to change the future land use designation, is what menu of options do you want to have in the master plan to rely on?
I think for me, the term general business seems very broad, and that if we were into a challenge, that could be a benefit for the challenger.
Right. I would say that the general business as it's been applied elsewhere within the city, within the context of our zoning code, is really looking at the C1 through C3 districts. It's not necessarily looking at the I districts, so no mini storage, that kind of thing. But I understand where you're coming from.
And I appreciate the approach that we're taking on Bennett Street. All of that area should be downsized to something less than industrial.
Does anybody have comments about the new sub-areas with the downtown district, the east and the west areas being implemented for this master plan revision? I personally love them, so thank you for, thinking about both sides of town so that we're not just all lumped in together. Specific characteristics, development strategies, or design guidelines that we take issue with that need to be redefined. Is there anything that needs added? I know we've just talked about preservation, the land use versus the zoning. Anything that pops out right now?
So I can bring it back up so this is development strategies for East Michigan. I don't mean to flash. It should all be in the packet too, if that helps you, so.
And you and I talked earlier, Mr. Harrington, about the gateway plan, but also, we talked about setbacks versus, my biggest concern has been is we've worked hard to preserve a green approach as you come into the city of Saline, unlike Pittsfield, which is putting buildings right smack onto the road, similar to what our downtown is. And having that kind of transition just seems to make the community more of a, it just makes it look better, I believe. And as you see, when you come on Michigan Avenue and Industrial, if you walk down those paths, that is the exact idea when we talk about pedestrian walkways and paths. The way those trees are planted, the way that green space is there, that is such a welcoming approach that continuing that is important to me. And you had mentioned about making sure that we don't necessarily spread all the properties across the buildings apart from each other, but I still want to see, however, we maintain green space and natural features throughout the community.
Right, absolutely. I don't think any of us are proposing to change the front setback of that SPA1 district, so that's the distance from you to the street, which would then require that green belt to be maintained. That's more about pushing or allowing buildings to be slightly closer together so they don't have to necessarily stretch the whole width of the property or leave, 50 feet on either side of them, which you then lose 100 feet for each specific development that's there.
Yeah, and I think most of that was put in place because we were talking large industrial buildings and not necessarily the smaller retail shops that we have right now. The one thing when we talk about office service too, and we talk about uses, is it possible, in there you mentioned commercial retail, but can we somehow say commercial retail, office service without drive-through?
Yeah, so the OS does have a specific section under a land use classification, I believe. I'm almost positive it does if it's featured on that future land use map. So that is something we can add.
That's the thing, we talked about changing it because it does allow banks, and that's my biggest concern is that in office service, then you have these drive-through services that we don't necessarily want to see here.
Okay, I think there might be a special land use provision that prohibits them from being in the OS district, regardless of whether it's a bank or not, but I think it only helps our case to have that in the master plan, that we're not interested in having. The OS district is specifically designed to not be as intense in terms of vehicle traffic, so.
Yeah, I would have to look up where exactly that zoning language is as well. And yeah, definitely, if you want to be that explicit in the master plan, that's the way to do it. If you want to leave some wiggle room, you could just have language about adverse traffic generation, careful consideration about vehicle trips, things like that. So if you imagine that maybe you want some exceptions to allow drive-throughs in some cases, you might want to reword it. But if it's going to be a black and white, no drive-throughs, then yeah, you could call that out.
Yeah, because I'm thinking the areas where we have office service or where we're kind of allowing it, the traffic already is an issue, and it's similar like Michigan Avenue, the number of curb cuts and things that would be required to do that. And then the other areas, the buildings are now reaching the point where they qualify as mid-century type of preservation and such. So even though we're identifying it on Ann Arbor Street being office service, those buildings are now qualified as historical type buildings, which are now advantages to that point of, I don't want to necessarily see somebody come in there and change those office service and build a bank and then turn it all into drive-through, so.
I guess one point specifically for you, Chair, is the West Michigan, as I know you live on that side. So we have a line here about potentially looking at a grocer or a pharmacist. This is something that we kind of got a lot of public feedback on about the lack of core services or core goods being provided on the west side of town. Is this a similar sentiment that's held by the Planning Commission? Do you think it should necessarily be a little bit broader in terms of that development strategy?
I think services would be great over there. The problem with the west side of town is that you have to cross Michigan Avenue twice if we need to get to any services, really. So I would encourage that new development is a service industry. But does anybody else have any comments about that? Does anybody feel strongly but me?
I mean, I try to identify trends, and I see additional housing development in that corridor, whether it exists within the corporate limits of the city of Saline or not. I think there's still going to be growth and development, particularly of a residential nature. So I think some of those core services, specifically a pharmacy or a grocery, would be of value to the existing residents and future residents in that area. And I find it not comical, but it makes me smile because the anchor grocery store for Saline for many years was Facios that existed in the west side right next to the laundromat in that shopping center along West US 12. Which then became, I believe, if I have the history correct, maybe Mrs. Hefner, Mr. Gearbuck can correct me, which became JMP's, which became Bush's.
Yeah, that was their first Bush, their first store. When you mentioned services, and I noticed on the other one, you said high-quality services and retail on the east side of town. What's the definition of high quality?
It's an aspirational statement. There's not really a specific definition. I would say, broadly speaking, at least in the way that I've been thinking about this specific issue, is not a Wendy's, it's a Chipotle, it's not a Jimmy John's or a Subway, it's a Panera Bread. Looking at like the next echelon of potentially cost to the consumer, but also something that has a little bit higher of a reputation, either for health reasons or just for general quality reasons, technically. So it is somewhat of a subjective statement. I think it's mainly meant to be kind of a guiding principle to state our value to what we're really hoping to see as a community in terms of development.
Because when I read that, I'm like thinking quality would be insufficient because we have at least types of stores that are secondhand type stores and things like that, that I don't know what they define as high quality.
Right. I mean, like I said, it's somewhat of a subjective statement. I mean, you could make, technically, you could try to make the argument that, like, New to You, again, is a higher quality than Goodwill. It's a local boutique. It's not a chain. They're maybe more selective with the goods that they take in. But again, it's an aspirational statement. There's no teeth to that specifically.
Yeah, it's one of those, I guess the challenge with all this language is that it does need to be flexible. So unlike the zoning ordinance, you want to be able to apply it to advance your goals, be it support discretionary decisions like special use approvals or rezoning considerations, but you also don't want to be overly specific to kind of tie yourself to a policy position that maybe you could change in the future. So we can look at that language specifically. Again, it's just, there's some nuance to it.
But I think whatever that language is applies to both sides. And I think
Sure.
that, for grocery, pharmacy, but there is the other service would be needed on that side of town too, that even like laundry or dry cleaning or something like that.
Could you go to the last slide so we can, for discussion points? Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Any feedback on the way we've classified land uses? Does anybody have any additional comment on that? On the future land use map, or are we opposed to any of the changes? Is there anything that you believe ought to be changed? I know Mr. Gearbach had many things that he has listed and will provide comments. Does anybody else have additional comments? And does anybody have anything else? Now's your time, or, providing comments.
So I really have nothing else, but I want to echo your comments that I do think the changes with regard to the sub-areas are good. They are bringing us into conformity with what is happening on the ground and what do we expect to be happening. So I appreciate the thought that went into it and eliminating some of the mismatch that's currently there.
And additionally, I know that this has been a ton of work, but the changes are fantastic. It's very easy to follow. It's great to see how you've moved things around and how you're trying to make it more streamlined, but give us, a place moving forward for the next 5 years. So thank you for your hard work for both of you.
Absolutely. I guess any other comments? Is the presentation clear? Would there be a different way for the next chapter that we bring back to make it a little bit easier to digest? We can do questions in the middle, potentially, to do sub-areas, and then future land use. I don't want to take up too much of your time when I go through this. So.
I do appreciate printing these out. I would appreciate having each map on a single page because they're just inherently hard to read.
Absolutely. We can provide that.
Any chance for 11 by 17 maps?
Yeah. Yes, we can make sure we print off some 11 by 17s for all of you so you have better copies. And I'll just keep a stack in case anyone accidentally wrecks their copy, like I usually do with mine. So.
Yeah, I would suggest 11 by 17 maps and maybe single-sided printing for this, just to be able to provide comments going forward. That would be just me.
That's a good idea.
Ben, is there anything related to, the whole schools changes and everything that we need to reflect differently?
Not necessarily. You could potentially change. The Teft Court would potentially be the only example where they bought that piece of land from Lee Bear across from our DPW facility. That said, if it were for whatever reason to sell, it would make sense to have it as an industrial use.
When I look at the school, now, generally at schools, there's some fields in there. They're looking at turning that thing into a complete sports complex and tournaments and high usage. So how do we address that to make sure that traffic and impact of that's going to be managed properly?
Yeah, I don't know what the best place in the master plan for addressing that is. So schools, by rule, are exempt from our zoning code. All public schools are, at least. So it makes it a little bit more challenging to address specific nuances with public schools because of that. Even if we designate it as a future land use, they're under no obligation to abide by our zoning, whether that be the setbacks, regulations, traffic issues. Do you have any ideas, Planner Harbach?
Depending on the specifics, I think there are some, yes, generally schools are exempt from zoning. I think there's some exceptions. So we can maybe talk offline about that.
And for me, it's not necessarily trying to zone it differently, but it's taking into account the usage of it. And it goes beyond just being a school where it's, 9 to 5. It's now going to become definitely probably 18 hours a day usage of that thing. And so all the impact that that has on the city and its sources and everything could be considering what we've seen happen, a major problem for us.
Okay. So my note for that was taking into account school property usage, the general use of the facilities for non-school purposes, athletic events, tournaments.
All right, so if we need to get you comments on this, drop dead date is 10/23/23. So start to review, mark up, send to Ben and Mike so that we're good to go. Our thoughts can be incorporated. Is there any additional comments or questions from the planning commission members?
Just a procedural
Yes.
question, Madam Chair. So the subsequent motion then at this juncture, Ben, would not be necessary?
I just have that motion. You can make a motion on really whatever you want. Like I said, the goal is to make it more of an action item because the mechanics of the discussion were a little bit wonky when we just had a single discussion item on the agenda.
I guess the planning commission can do whatever it wants to do, of course, but my recommendation would be just to hold off and make a motion to incorporate after the 23rd when we received all the comments and reviewed every section.
I agree.
So we don't need to take any subsequent action unless a member or the board feels otherwise.
No comments with that? All right, if there's no additional comments, we have discussion item on 207 Monroe, the Heritage.
Yes, so we did receive a final submittal, PUD submittal from Danny Berry, Planner Auerbach, and Sally Boss from OHM. Had the opportunity to review and, oh, my bad. I wonder what that was. I had the opportunity to review and provide feedback. So there are some deficiencies with their final submittal. So it is their right, if they would like to proceed, but we're going to strongly suggest that they resubmit a different final, correcting some of those deficiencies, things from like not including a landscape plan or elevations, just to make sure that we have complete information on what we're approving. It's going to be one of the most interesting single-family developments in the community, one of the smallest for sure. So making sure that we have a complete picture before we bring it forward to you. So I imagine that will come back at some point in October for final review for you all.
Thank you.
Mr. Gearbud, apart from 207 Monroe Street, do you want to comment on our upcoming training session for committee chairs and committee members?
Yeah, this is for the idea of, we're trying to talk about having more committee training and understanding of our roles and such that we have in our positions, appointments, and so forth. So on October 9th at 6 p.m., we're encouraging everybody that participates in these different groups, especially the chairs, to attend these meetings so that they can have a better understanding of what their role is and what goes on and what we have expectations as a council.
Great, thank you. Is there a motion to excuse the absence of Beardsley and Fosdick?
So moved.
All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion to adjourn at 7:45?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you very much.